Hey guys, my name is Missy Kai. Thank you so much for being here with me today. This is the Loneliness, Longing, and Horniness workshop. So I decided to teach a whole workshop on this topic because I'm about 3 months into quarantine right now, and I know a lot of my students are struggling with these kinds of uncomfortable or difficult emotions. And obviously we might encounter these feelings at any time, so I figured this information is really useful for people who might be struggling with these things right now. So that being said, not a lot of people are talking about these kinds of emotions, or if they are, it's at a very surface level. So I really wanted to create the space to do a deep dive into these exact subjects and contextualize some of these more difficult emotions so that you can understand them better. And at the end of our workshop today, I'll give you some very specific tips and pointers on how you can cope with these emotions in healthy ways. So why am I talking about this subject? I want to take this out of the taboo world and shed some light on it and place it into context so that we can understand these feelings, we can meet them and tend to them and learn something about ourselves in the process. This workshop can be part of your own self-care and part of your own personal development and education in exploring your sexuality and exploring your relationship to yourself, to your body, and to other people. So who am I? My name is Missy Kai. I am a sovereign sexuality and intimacy coach. I'm based in West Los Angeles and the Bay Area up in San Francisco. I also do therapeutic body work and specialize in rehabilitative mobility. So that's quite a mouthful, and I like to just condense that down and say I'm a somatic healer. I help people feel more connected to their bodies and to be and live a more embodied life, and I relate that specifically back to their sexuality because I feel like not a lot of people are doing that right now, and I feel like any kind of work that you do in this area of your life is going to ripple out and benefit so many other areas of your life, namely your relationships, but also your relationship to yourself, your relationship to your body. And when things do start to turn over from quarantine, we want to engage with others in a very conscious way. And even when we're not in quarantine, you may be struggling with these kinds of thoughts, feelings, and emotions. So I want to normalize all of these for you, contextualize them, and then give you some clear pointers for how to move through these in a healthy way. So I don't like to take a lot of time in workshops to go through like my whole story and what my credentials are and stuff like that. If you guys want to learn more about me, I have a whole page of my credentials and stuff listed on my website. You can connect with me on Instagram. I talk about my background and story a lot there. Really, what I do as a professional is I work with people mostly one-on-one, but also through, workshops and online courses such as this one to help them heal their relationship to their body and heal their relationship to their sexuality. And the two are very, very interrelated. Okay, so if you see me looking down, it's because I'm looking at my notes. This is actually the second time that I've taught this workshop. I taught it the first time as a live workshop, and unfortunately I did not record that workshop. So it's a lot more fun when I have a live audience to interact with, and I have some of my students here. But I don't have that today, so I'll just be speaking directly to you, and I'll try to speak to some of the comments, or the ones that I can remember at least, that my students brought up when we did the workshop the first time. So I'm sorry, you guys, that I didn't record it, but I wanted to make sure to re-record it again so you have access to this information. So if you see me looking down, it's because I want to make sure I get all of the juicy details out and sharing them with you so that you can use them in your own practices. Okay, so let's start. We'll dissect each of those emotions. We'll talk about them in a little bit more detail. I've done a lot of research and preparation for this workshop, but I'm just going to speak to these concepts in a very conversational way. So we'll break down each of the three emotions: loneliness, longing, and horniness. We'll discuss the relationship that they have to each other, and then I'll give you those pointers. All right, so let's dive right in. So what is loneliness. Loneliness is similar to isolation and solitude, but they're key and distinct concepts. So I want to clearly define those because we'll be discussing loneliness in particular. So solitude is when you are, it's the state of being alone. It's just when you are alone, you are in solitude. So solitude doesn't necessarily have any negative connotations, although it can be used as a form of punishment. You know, when somebody commits a really heinous crime, they might be locked in solitary confinement. So solitude is not necessarily a bad thing, it just describes a state of being. And that's contrasted with isolation. Isolation is when somebody is cut off from support that they need from their community in order to thrive and be a healthy human. So comparing solitude with isolation, solitude again just describes a state of being, whereas isolation is a lack of social relationships and a lack of emotional support. So I want to clarify with these things that spending time alone is not inherently bad, and solitude can be a healthy, rejuvenating experience, especially if you've been living a really high stress, high demand, high activity lifestyle. Actually slowing down and taking things a little bit easier can feel stressful for you, or possibly stressful for you because you're used to being at a certain level of chaos and activity all the time. And so when you start to slow down and drop off of that, or not have as much interaction around you, it can bring up a lot of emotion inside of you. And so a lot of people have a really difficult time spending time in solitude. It's very difficult for them to get to that place and be at peace with themselves in that place. And that kind of, you know, depends on your personality. Like introverts might enjoy more solitude. Extroverts might really need to have more interaction with other people in order to function at their highest level. So the amount of solitude that you need might fluctuate. It might be fluid over the period of a day, over the period of a week, or even throughout various cycles in your life, depending on you know, your personality, depending on your situation, your circumstances, etc., etc. So I want to distinguish isolation and loneliness. So loneliness is not a state of being. It's not necessarily describing social or emotional isolation, but loneliness can probably be best described as the difference between the amount of connection that you're able to access and the amount of connection that you're craving, that you're yearning for. And so it's that, it's almost like a math equation. It's like you can take that distance and that is your loneliness. So loneliness is distinguished from solitude in that loneliness is usually not a choice. Again, it's the difference between how much you want versus how much you're getting. So you might find that at certain times, you're happy to have space and you're happy to have time to yourself, and you're really craving some time to yourself. Like maybe you go home over the holidays and you know, you spend time with your family and you're there for like a week, and by the end of it, you're like, wow, you know, my family's great, but I just really need some alone time to rest and recharge. I need some solitude right now. That's different than a more chronic or deeper feeling of like, you want to be with and around other people and engaging and connecting with them in a meaningful way, but not really being able to access that. And then the difference between that is, in social isolation, is that loneliness is more temporary, whereas isolation also has a longer period of time to it generally, where somebody may have been cut off from a family member, or you know, there may have been a certain trauma happened or falling out or anything like that, and now they're isolated from that friend group. That happens quite a lot to survivors of sexual trauma, or perhaps after breakups, divorce. You know, it's quite common for people to lose friendships in the process of that. So when you go through that kind of experience, that kind of descent or that kind of initiation, there might very well be a period of time where you feel isolated and cut off from the community that you once had and shared with that person, and that is a form of trauma, and it's difficult to work through, and feelings of loneliness might arise from that isolation. So I want to distinguish that kind of social isolation from emotional isolation. I think it's important to distinguish the two. Emotional isolation is when people do not get the proper emotional support that they need. They don't have a healthy outlet for processing and working through their feelings, or they may have avoidant patterns in intimacy where it's hard for them to go to that level and be open and be vulnerable with another human being. And this might be irrespective of whether or not they have a social network. Like, just because somebody has a lot of friends and a lot of people who know them, that doesn't necessarily mean that they feel emotionally nourished by those connections. And so in our day-to-day lives, we want to make sure to make time for nourishing those types of connections and really dropping in with people and having heart-to-heart check-ins. But there's a lot of reasons why somebody might not feel safe or trusting enough to be able to open themselves up in that way to another person. Maybe they were teased or bullied as a little kid. Maybe they've never had a safe space to open up in that way. Maybe it's difficult for them to communicate what their emotions are or what they're feeling. They may not have a lot of experience or practice with that. Or they may have grown up in a household where they were told, you just have to deal with it. Or for men, hearing sentiments like man up, you should just pull yourself up by your bootstraps, or deal with it, or no crying, or crying is for girls, or any number of culturalisms that we condition men into thinking that showing any kind of emotion makes you weak or vulnerable or bad or wrong. And then for women, even though it is more socially acceptable to share and discuss your feelings, that doesn't necessarily mean that you are being received and you feel heard and you feel seen and understood and cherished by the people with whom that you're sharing those feelings with. So that can lead somebody to feel emotionally isolated even if they're around other people. And if you feel this way over a long period of time, that might cause you to shut down or withdraw and avoid going places that you might have enjoyed before, or avoid people and conversations so as not to create a conflict there. It really is a defense mechanism, and we really have to look at, are there deeper patterns going on? Was there an instance of fidelity? Is there an abusive relationship in their past? What kinds of things may have led to trust issues? So emotional isolation can lead to mental health imbalances over time, because we need to get thoughts outside of our head and to know that our emotions are validated and seen and held within our community, and that others can create that safe space for us to move through an emotional experience. Otherwise, going through that kind of trying experience all by yourself can definitely make you feel very isolated and very cut off. So, for example, when everybody's in quarantine, that may have caused you to feel emotionally isolated, even though we're all going through the same thing. It may have been difficult for you to vocalize the depth and the different layers of what your experience was of that, and there's probably several waves that you were going through too. So again, isolation is, when we get to that point, we want to start thinking about, like, okay, what kinds of support can we bring in? Can we talk to a therapist? Can we reach out to another friend group? Who do we feel like we can trust to discuss some of these feelings with? So I want to point out the role of, or the interplay of, age and gender in feeling isolated and feeling lonely. So again, isolation is like a more severe state of loneliness. Loneliness is the difference between how much connection you want and how much connection you're getting. So as adults age, they tend to have fewer and fewer interactions with friends outside of, their immediate household or their immediate family. And this is an epidemic. We are having an epidemic of loneliness in America, even though our technology makes us more and more connected with each other. It's not necessarily the kind of connection that we find nourishing at an emotional and intellectual and at a soul level. People really, really do need that face-to-face time with each other, and they need to know that they can connect with another person who will see them for who they are and will see them as a whole person and be able to reflect back those qualities in another person. I think some of the times that we feel most seen in our life is when another person can see the qualities, the redeeming qualities within us, and remind us of those qualities within ourselves in the way that we share and have an interaction with each other. But like I was saying, so as people get older, it's harder and harder for them to seek out, find, create, and nourish those connections, usually because a lot of obligations come in, working crazy hours at a job to try to make ends meet. Maybe you're taking care of young children, maybe you're taking care of a sick parent, maybe you just get really engrossed into your marriage or your relationship, and that takes away free time that you used to spend with your friends. So as we age, it gets harder and harder typically to keep and nourish these connections. And then gender also plays a role with this. So men have a lot harder time with feelings of loneliness, and they experience loneliness more than women do. And I think there's a lot of reasons for this. A few that I've encountered in my research is the traditional masculine ideology, again, very much revolves around being strong, being the provider, planning, holding space for other people, and not breaking down and showing any kind of weakness. And so even the act of reaching out to somebody and saying, hey, I've been feeling kind of lonely lately, is it okay if we schedule a time to drop in? That in itself can be really, really vulnerable for men to say and just come out with. Honestly, it's usually masked by something else. The other reason is that a lot of times male touch, especially from older men, is viewed as sexually suspicious or sexually suspect or sexually dangerous or threatening. It's like all male touch is dangerous, and so therefore you have to keep your touch to yourself. And so as men age, there's fewer and fewer opportunities for them to enjoy healthy, platonic, non-sexual touch. Most of the touch that they're getting is going to be coming from their intimate partners or their lover or whoever they're in a relationship with. And so if there's any kind of imbalance going on sexually within the relationship, and again, these things tend to pop up the longer that you've been somebody, and the older that you get, the more it compounds itself. So a lot of older men are cut off from social networks or aren't getting the kind of nourishment that they need from their social networks, and then they can't. They also have a hard time finding access to healthy, platonic, non-sexual touch. The combination of those factors leads somebody to feel very, very lonely. So the age thing also holds true for women, but it is harder for men, particularly. And I want to read this. A British survey found 2.5, that's 1 in 8 male Britons have no close friends, and 51% have 2 or fewer close friendships. So that's half of the men in Britain only have 2 or fewer close friendships. So if you're relying on 1 or 2 people to meet all of your emotional needs, that can put a lot on that one person, and it can feel insufficient for the intensity or the level of emotion that you're going for. Like if you're really, really lonely and we want to fill our cups like this much, somebody may only have the capacity to fill our cup this much, and so it will still feel like there's a deficit even though you've been able to maybe speak with that one person. In reality, it really does take a village, and we, you know, and I'm trying to think of the best way to say this. So in the tribal days, we would have a village that would keep us company, and you would be with that village for the most part from the time that you were young until the time that you were old. So everybody would know you, and there would be no hiding of trying to be this, trying to be that, presenting a certain image of yourself to make people like you. They just knew who you were. And so when a villager was depressed or committed a crime, the tribes people would come together and hold that person in the center of the circle and remind them who they are, and remind them that they are seen, and show them that the community cares for them. And it was within that safe container of the tribe that somebody was able to be accountable to their to their morals, to the values of the tribe, and remember who they are, and remember the wholeness of who they are as a human being. So I also wanted to say another interesting factoid from my research. Same study about British men. Despite this isolation, men are less likely to admit feeling lonely. A 2012 study found men were more socially isolated than women. However, men and women reported similar satisfaction with their social support network. The study's authors suggest the discrepancy is due to gender socialization. The men may have been reluctant to admit that they were lonely for fear of showing vulnerability. So that just goes back to what I was saying earlier, which is that, again, there's this huge stigma against men to show any kind of emotional vulnerability. And women equally might feel that same stigma. They might feel kind of pressure to look like they have everything together, or they might try to reach out to their girlfriends and get support but not feel completely supported or seen or held in the ways that they need to. So how does this all interplay to feelings of loneliness? So loneliness, again, is that discrepancy of connection. So if we are feeling lonely and feeling like we're not getting the kinds of connections and nourishment that we need, we're not filling our emotional cups, we're not filling our cups for healthy touch, we're not filling our cups for deep, meaningful connection and conversation, then longing can develop. And longing is distinguished from loneliness in that it is a deep yearning for something that we are missing or unable to access. So longing doesn't necessarily have to be for touch. You might find that you long for smells or certain dishes or a certain person's energy or presence. Longing can also be very closely tied to our erotic desires. There might be a certain pain or grief or sadness for it. It's like a very deep yearning. It's just like, I want to draw this thing closer to me, whatever it is, whatever your object of longing is. So with longing, there's a requirement for us to integrate a shadow part of our psyche when we're looking to face this. It's an uncomfortable process because it's something that we can't get or don't have access to. So, but are really, really deeply craving and wanting. So in order to drop into this space and to know what your longing is, I like to distinguish longing from impulse and craving in the sense of there's a sacred need underlying your longing. So a craving like for a snack or something sugary or something like that, that could be, a stress response, an emotionally based stress response potentially, but longing is a deeper yearning and craving that is pointing you back towards a sacred need. So you may be longing, for example, if you haven't had a good bodywork session in a while, you might be longing for some good touch. You're like, I just have this spot in my back. I'm really longing for this. I haven't been able to touch or see anybody in 3 months because of the pandemic. Okay, well, what's underneath that? Is it really the massage? No, the longing is for, again, that sense of connection, that sense of relief, and that sense of being back and embodied in your own body and not having to hold that space for yourself, of being able to allow yourself the gift of dropping into that space with somebody else and them doing that with and for you. So the relationship in that sense between longing and horniness makes a lot of sense, because they both really point towards these deeper yearnings and perhaps these shadow parts of our psyche where our sacred needs are not being met. And I always try to redirect my students back to the sacred need, because it's like, what is underneath that longing? Is it really the ice cream, or is it a need for comfort? Is it really like this hedonistic sexual encounter, or is it a need to express yourself and not feel judged for the ways that you want to express yourself? And that is taking the form of promiscuity or hedonism. Again, nothing against hedonists. I mean, there's just so many different examples, right? Or you find yourself longing for a past lover, but really the sacred need underneath that is the comfort and the familiarity and the security that you felt when you were with that person. So with your longing, I invite you to really sit in your body and hold it close to you and ask, like, what is the need underneath this longing? What would help me tend to that need the most? And so longing may or may not go away when the longing is fulfilled. Fulfilling that longing can either increase it or satisfy it. So this has a lot to do with how Eros is cultivated within our relationship. Sometimes we just have a really deep longing for somebody, and when we do satisfy that longing, there's this romantic cycle that we go through where we just crave them even more, and we long for them even more, and we see how amazing this person is. Or we might have a longing for a certain kind of encounter, or a certain kind of experience, and once it's satisfied, then that longing might cease or start to wane and slowly go away. So either way, your longing is a valid emotion, and it is really important to put that longing into the context of your other emotions. Recognize that your circumstances may be putting stress on you in a certain way that's leading you to feel lonely, and then that loneliness over time can escalate into longing, right? And so when we are longing for something and we don't have a way to fulfill that longing, to meet that sacred need, the need doesn't go away, the need is always there, so the need is going to get louder. And that louder might look like horniness. It might look like a lot of sexual craving. It might look like a whole variety of different behaviors that are meant to help you cope, but may not be the healthiest thing for you. So this creates horniness. So there are very, very few equations in sexuality, especially sovereign sexuality, the specific approach that I take to this, to coaching intimacy. But there is one formula that I will share with you today, and it's that attraction plus obstacles equals arousal, sexual arousal, or excitement, whatever word resonates with you. So again, that equation is attraction plus obstacles equals sexual excitement or arousal. So when we're in this place of being lonely, we're longing for a sacred need to be met, and that sacred need can be for touch, it can be for sexual intimate connection, it can be for physical connection, it can be just for a good emotional conversation. All of that is valid. When that longing is not met, the sacred need does not go away, it's still there. And so horniness might start to pop up because we are attracting something in, we're attracted to something, but there's an obstacle there. We're not able to access it for some reason. In the pandemic, we can't access it maybe because we can't touch each other and we have to be socially distanced and spend 6 feet apart. So maybe you're able to see a friend, but you're not able to touch them. And so that longing and that craving is still there. well, that obstacle plus the attraction is going to create horniness. And I just want to humanize this for a moment, because horniness can very, very much be closely related to emotions of boredom, frustration, inadequacy, a feeling of like hopelessness or despair or grief, frustration, things like that, because it gives us an outlet for it. It gives us a moment of sexual release, and when that need is not getting met, it's going to start getting louder, and that horniness is your body's intelligent, natural response to say, hey, you're not getting the kind of connection you need, so I'm going to turn on this circuitry within you to incentivize you to go out and find this kind of connection that you're craving. Does that make sense? So it's like, all right, it starts off as maybe an emotion, you start to feel a little bit lonely, or because of your circumstances you are isolated, that creates a feeling of loneliness. Then that loneliness leads to a deeper longing, and that unmet longing and that unmet sacred need leads you to feel horny, and you're like, I'm so frustrated because I'm horny and I don't know what to do with this. And it's funny too, because, you know, in the pandemic, it's almost like the naughtiness factor of you're obviously not supposed to be seeing people outside of your house, and now is not the greatest time to be doing a bunch of dating, because, you know, what are you going to do anyway? The best thing you can do is go out to a restaurant, but like, or at least at this current moment of time in California. But because there is that barrier there that wasn't necessarily there before, it creates sort of like this naughty taboo element to it, and that naughtiness factor, again, is an obstacle that is smack dab in the middle of our horniness equation, which is that attraction plus obstacles equal arousement, or arousal. So that barrier of not being able to see or touch people in the way that you want is only going to increase the horniness and increase the excitement of having a potential encounter like that. So the higher the barrier to access, the greater the perceived reward of overcoming that obstacle. So the more exciting something is, the more it arouses us, and the more release that we perceive to get from it. So we have to be careful with this. This can create a cycle where we need more and more and more stimulation to feel the same sense of release, and this can become addictive. So for example, porn and pornography may give you a temporary release of feeling like, okay, yes, I've masturbated and I'm horny and I was able to get out, you know, I was able to ejaculate or I was able to have an orgasm. But because you are staring at a screen and it's not the real kind of sustenance or interaction, connection that you were craving, you may get a release from it, but have a drop afterwards where you feel ashamed or guilty or even more lonely, because your body knows the difference between receiving that sustenance in real time and watching it on a screen. It's not real. So we have to be careful with that, because horniness can be a nourishing force for us, but we have to be mindful in the way that we interact with it, especially if we're in a place of feeling lonely and intense longing for something. And I know that's way easier said than done. I know it's so tempting just to go out and, you know, take the easy route out, but I really invite you to sit into the discomfort of these emotions and just recognize how they all interplay with each other. And again, I hope to contextualize some of this for you so you can understand why you might be feeling super horny and frustrated the second that you are not able to see other people day to day in your life. And as the pandemic continued on for a longer period of time, that may have gotten harder and harder for you to cope with. So this would be the point. If I had a live audience, I would stop and ask if you guys had any questions. I'm trying to remember the questions that my students asked from from our last webinar. So that was a lot of information. I'll go into the points next about how to cope with these uncomfortable emotions in healthy ways. But first, I want you just to kick back wherever you are. Take a deep breath. Comfort yourself. You can put a hand over your belly, hand over your heart. Maybe close your eyes and just take a moment to absorb and saturate in all this juicy information. We can take just 3 deep breaths. Good. And shake it out if you need to. Slowly come back to the call. So, to summarize all of that, loneliness, longing, and horniness are the perfect storm to incite us into doing things that we normally wouldn't even consider, such as risky sexual behaviors, casual encounters, or high consumption of porn. We may be judging ourselves harshly or feel shame and embarrassment for these feelings coming up, but know that they are perfectly natural and human. So just because something is typically seen as a negative or uncomfortable emotion doesn't mean that that emotion is not there to serve you. Emotions always act as cycles, and there's always a period where there's an increasing of the intensity of the emotion, and then you kind of hit the peak, or that peak of the wave, and then it starts to wane, and then you hit the trough, or the downslope of that emotional wave and that cycle. So ride those emotional waves, ride those emotional cycles, tend to yourself, keep turning your presence inward, and it will start to feel better with time. Okay, so that being said, I want to go into some ways that you can cope with these feelings in healthy ways, specifically as it pertains to your sexuality as well. Okay, so the great thing about alone time and solitude is that it offers us a space to act preventively, and it offers us a space to go inside and do this deep inner shadow excavation work within ourselves. So I always like to call emotions as energy in motion. They're messengers. They have a lesson for us to learn. And in that vein, really listening deeply and creating that space for yourself to sit into a moment of silence and stillness will help guide you and develop your inner intuition towards taking right action in response to each of these emotions. So with my students, I always say, take what resonates and leave the rest, or come back for it later. Some aspects of this workshop may really resonate with you. Other aspects you may not resonate with as much. I know I've spoken a lot to the male experience on this because that's more of my specialty and my practice, but this can apply to anybody. So, never abdicate your own sovereignty or your own critical thinking and taking in this information. So these are all just suggestions. You can do all of them, you can do one of them, or do as many of them as resonates. Okay, so my first suggestion, because all of these emotions really center around how much connection are we getting with somebody else, we need to look at what does our social life look like? How are we tending to our social life? What kinds of relationships are we cultivating? And how are we cultivating those relationships in healthy ways? Okay, so I would say look at your calendar. Look at how many times you've hung out with friends or spoken to friends or had some kind of meaningful period of connection. And maybe over like the course of a week or the course of a month, and just figure out like, what is your range? How many times do you usually hang out with friends? Is it once or twice a month? Is it once or twice a week? Are you used to seeing friends every single day? It's like, how much interaction do you need is the point of this. And put some kind of quantitative measurement to it. And this felt, I went through this exercise for myself and I felt kind of ridiculous the first time that I went through it. I'm like, why am I measuring my friend time? But it actually, just like you would measure your health, your weight, your screen time, anything else, your social interaction time is again, another important measure of how much connection are you getting. And if that amount of time has been a lot lower than what you're used to, well, then no wonder you're feeling this way. It's very logical. So then we need to just increase that amount of time in a way that's meaningful for you. So, I mean, again, it depends on your personality. It depends on your how much engagement you want socially. Some people like to live completely off-grid in the woods and not hear from anybody for ages, and some people really need to have a very close daily interaction and regular interaction with their crew. So wherever you're at on that spectrum, that's a beautiful thing. You're also allowed to move on that spectrum and be fluid in how much social interaction you want and need, depending on what's going on in your life. So just take a quick assessment within the last month or so. How often did you hang out with somebody? How often did you speak to somebody in a connected and meaningful way? And how much are you doing that right now? So that's like a very logical, analytical way to approach things. The other way to approach things is to reach out and talk to a close friend and really just share what's going on with you candidly and honestly. And this was something that surprised me and how meaningful and effective it was just to tell somebody, like, I'm kind of having a rough day right now and I'm really in my feels right now. Like I had a group friend chat going during quarantine that we started, and I posted in there one day. I was like, guys, I don't know what it is, but today I'm just feeling especially down and it's been hard for me. I feel like I'm just super alone right now, and I'm wondering if anybody else is feeling this. And I think like 5 different people replied back and said they were going through the exact same thing or had felt something similar earlier in the week, or had heard different friends saying something along the same lines. And it wasn't so much that they said that to me, but the feeling of like knowing I wasn't alone in feeling that way and that I wasn't the only one who had that feeling made me feel a lot better, because it made me feel more human. It made me feel like there wasn't something wrong with me for having these feelings, because other people were having the same feelings too. So even if your friend is not necessarily going through that process, it's very likely that as human beings, we at some time in our life will encounter the experience and the emotion of being lonely or being horny or having a deep longing that is going unmet for us. And that vulnerability can be a portal or an opening for you to meaningfully connect with somebody, because it's a very authentic truth that you're sharing with somebody. And it can serve as a point for starting a really good conversation about how, the current events are affecting you, and, diving into different aspects of that. For the most part, I found that people are really willing to discuss those things. And even if they're not normally the kind of person who would discuss those things, by bringing this offering to them, you're creating the space and inviting them to step into this container with you where it is safe to talk about these things. So it's always a little scary to be the first person to, offer your feelings and emotions and to speak to those, but in doing so, you show leadership, you show emotional intelligence, and you show ownership over yourself and your emotions. So I really encourage you guys to reach out to your friends. Okay, doing something for your community. If we're feeling isolated, lonely, horny, frustrated, bored, all of these things, a great way to shake ourselves out of that is to do something nice for somebody else. And this sounds really counterintuitive, but especially when we're feeling depressed and down, it may feel like a huge effort to take care of ourselves, but it might feel easier to do something nice for somebody else. So this could be volunteering, this could be asking a friend who's going through a tough time, hey, how can I support you, or offering a specific kind of support. It could be as simple as giving a friend a ride to the airport, so you have that time to chat and connect with each other. It could be any kind of thing. It could be getting involved with a political group or a nonprofit organization, or it could be spent learning more about a cause. But I'm encouraging these things specifically because they give people a sense of higher purpose and they give people a sense of belonging. If you're around a group of people, say, at a church or at a gym or any other kind of, common interest that you share, it gives people a sense of belonging and purpose and saying, okay, in doing these things, I see that my life is meaningful and I see that my actions have a really large impact on other people and their actions impact me as well too. And there's that altruistic cycle and that feedback cycle that you get. And so it's not so much that you're going out and doing nice things for other people, it's that you're using your actions as a vehicle for connection with those who share common interests with you and are like-minded people. Or even if they're not like-minded people. All right, the other, I have a few more tips for you guys here. So the other tip I want to share is to prioritize your creative outlet. So we want to engage these creative outlets enough so that it's not overwhelming, but keeps you interested and is a healthy, fun, playful thing for you. So anything that you like to do that you're not necessarily doing for money or not necessarily for anybody else other than yourself and because you enjoy it. This could be golf, it could be playing music, it could be writing poetry, it could be painting, it could be literally anything. But if it's been a while since you nourished your creative hobbies and your creative outlets, then when you're horny and lonely, this is a perfect time to pick some of those things back up. Our sexual energy is fundamentally our creative energy, and so when there's a buildup of sexual energy, we haven't gotten that release that we want in a while, then funneling that energy into creative outlets can be a great way to discern how we use that energy in productive and healthy ways. Now, I'm not saying playing the guitar is like the same feeling as having sex, although some people might argue me on that. I'm a drummer personally, but fundamentally our creative force and our sexual force that live within us are nourished by each other. So when we do have an opportunity to meet that deeper longing, that sacred need within us, and have our longings satisfied, we can come to it in a way where we're not desperate or clinging or grabbing or having all of this emotional charge around it, because we've taken the time to tend to sit with it and to channel that emotion into a creative, healthy outlet. Okay? So there's like maybe 5 more here that I want to get through, and I'll go as quickly as I can. Most of the rest of these have a lot to do with self-care, so I put some suggestions in here. Input more white space into your calendar and adjust expectations. So I know I just talked about doing creative work, but if you're feeling really depressed, if you're feeling really lonely and it's been a while and you're like emotionally isolated, it's been a while since you've had that kind of connection with somebody, or you don't have that kind of connection available to you, it could be helpful just to give yourself more time to do things in your calendar. So looking at ways that you can simplify, like what is not necessary for you right now, or what can be put off until a later time, just so you give yourself more time to transition between activities, because when we're living life at a really frantic pace constantly and not giving ourselves breaks for check-in or breaks to take care of ourselves throughout the day, that can certainly wear us down emotionally and cause some of these uncomfortable feelings to arise. And so I know this can be especially true for entrepreneurs and parents with young children who are juggling a lot of things, including a career. So as much as possible, try to keep space open in your calendar and have at least one day a week where you're not working, not doing anything, not trying to put a lot of obligations on yourself. It's super, super important to have enough time for rest and recovery. So that being said, that's one of the final tips, is to reassess your priorities around self-care. And a lot of people don't include their sexuality in their self-care practices, but this is absolutely the reason why I teach my students to develop self-care practices around sovereign sexuality in our work together one-on-one. The idea of that work is to give somebody a personalized practice that's catered to them to help them deepen their experience of connection to themselves and to their own body, and to feel very connected to their own sexuality. And again, if you've had any history of trauma, abuse, you're recovering from a breakup, divorce, anything like that, that has a lot of emotional charge around it. So we need to go very slowly, and we need to be consistent with those practices. This is not a one and done, overnight kind of thing. So just like brushing your teeth or flossing or doing movement or breathing practice, meditation, we also need to have some kind of practice with your sexuality, to engage with it, to nurture it, to interact with it in some kind of way, whether or not you're in a relationship. So regardless of what your relationship status is, we always have some kind of sovereign sexuality practice that we're using for ourselves, and that gives us the basis and the foundation to, again, enter into these beautiful exchanges with more self-awareness and from a more embodied and grounded place. We offer ourselves as a clear container instead of one that's full of all of this excess energy and emotion, so to speak. And the last couple techniques that I'll share with you is just, and I talked about this a little bit before, is to consume pornography and social media mindfully. I know it's really easy to get sucked into both. And like I discussed before, they can initially help, but ultimately might make things worse. So set limits, especially if you masturbate and it creates a lot of tension in your body, or if you look at social media and you get lost in comparison-itis, or find yourself scrolling for hours and hours and hours. We need to pull ourselves back off of that, reduce the amount of screen time that we have, and just look at how is social media and pornography feeding into our longings and our horniness in a way that's not necessarily healthy for us. In Tantra, men are very much taught to be discerning with their sexual energy, and they're taught to upcycle their sexual energy from their sacral chakra into their heart chakra and spread that light throughout the whole body. They're encouraged to practice edging and to practice semen retention as a way of using discernment in how they use their sexual energy. Women, on the other hand, in Tantra are very often encouraged to relax, to orgasm as much as possible, to let themselves have this experience of surrender and release. So that doesn't necessarily mean you have to watch porn. That doesn't necessarily mean you have to grab a Hitachi wand either. It could just be, for men, for example, a practice of when you experience arousal or experience horniness, finding ways to cycle that energy within yourself, or channeling it into a creative outlet, or recognizing that that energy doesn't necessarily have to go anywhere, that you can contain that energy within yourself and upcycle it within yourself, and let that nice arousal, that tingly kind of warm sensation spread throughout your whole body without necessarily needing to release it in terms of ejaculation. So this will take some practice, and this workshop is not a course on semen retention, but there are a lot of great coaches out there who can teach you that if you're into learning about that. I encourage you to be curious and to research. And then for the women who may be using pornography, I encourage you to use your imagining and visualization capacities, women are typically more like mentally and emotionally stimulated to get horny and to have that sexual experience. Use your visualization in your mind to create that experience for yourself, because then you'll be able to understand better what exactly about that gets you off. Like, what role are you playing in a fantasy, or what about the situation turns you on, because that tells you about your own psyche, and it also tells you about the kind of things that turn you on, and that can be used to consciously communicate to your next partner, hey, this is what really turns me on, this is what drives me up the wall, or I've been wanting to share this kind of fantasy with somebody, etc., etc. And that creates an opening for your partner to satisfy and please you. And that's really a beautiful thing. And then for both parties, and in the place of porn, and for my non-binary folks as well too, again, take what resonates, leave the rest. You can always practice self-touch in front of a mirror, or you can always practice self-massage instead. I have another self-massage workshop. It is a sensual self-massage workshop, so we go over areas like touching the neck, the shoulders, the inner thigh area, just areas that people normally don't have touched on a regular basis. So learning to desexualize all of your touch, and then touch yourself in nourishing ways that are not necessarily tied to pornography, are going to help you stay in a more embodied place when you do have a real life physical intimate connection or energy exchange with somebody. A lot of men who have ED or erectile dysfunction a lot of times cannot get off unless it's with porn, because they've watched so much porn that they've literally trained themselves to only be able to ejaculate that way. So obviously that's not what we want. We want to be able to enjoy that experience real time with our partners. So we don't want to elevate a visualization of a sexual experience over the actual experience itself, and being able to be completely present and comfortable with ourselves in that experience. Okay, so watch a little bit less porn. If you're watching a lot of it, consume a little bit less social media if you're on there constantly, and just notice what's on your social media feed too. How is it making you feeling? Is it making you feel more lonely? Is it making you feel inadequate? Is it making you feel jealous of other people? It's just like, don't follow those people. Your life is uniquely yours, and you don't know what that person's story is. You don't know how much money they're making. You don't know if their success is authentic or not. You know, it's hard to judge things from a highlight reel, so just keep that in mind too. Okay, so the last tip I want to give you is to create thirst traps, like literal stops to catch your thirst. So it's like, I know I get horny when blank. So, you know, after a period of time, you start to notice situations or environments or circumstances where you're more vulnerable to these kinds of emotions coming up. And so to prevent these things coming up, you can create thirst traps for yourself. So for me, my thirst trap is talking to my girlfriends regularly. So anytime that I feel like I have been going too far in looking for my longings for connection to be fulfilled from potential dates or intimate partners or anything like that, I'm realizing that I'm projecting that longing onto somebody else and expecting them to fulfill that for me, when really what I need is just to be seen, and not necessarily have like a transactional component to that, right? So just touching back in with my girlfriends, having that energy, being held in that is really, really powerful for me. So really my girlfriends are thirst traps for me. So anytime I start to like feel myself get too overly aroused or strung out, or just like horny with like nowhere to put that energy, or nothing to do with it, because maybe you're not seeing somebody during that time, or whatever the circumstances are, spend more time with your friends. Create that thirst trap for yourself, and nurture it regularly. And then finally, as we emerge from quarantine, and as we look at how can we address loneliness and horniness, I highly encourage you guys to form pods or quarantine pods. A lot of people are, say for example, if you have young children, I know some parents are saying, okay, we'll only let our kids play together, we'll only see each other. Maybe another couple that lives close by. If you and your partner are living together, maybe just the four of you guys hang out together. Maybe you meet up with your basketball friend once a week and you guys just hang out a little bit, and that's it. So you can slowly start opening yourself up. I encourage you guys to have conversations about who it is that you're seeing as we come out of quarantine, just in the same way that you would have like the relationship talk with somebody, so you can have the quarantine talk with people in your pod and agree to boundaries and expectations and get clarity on all of that. So as we're navigating the re-entry into quote-unquote normal life, I don't think it'll ever be the same as it was before, but as we re-enter more back into society and interact with more and with other people, you can have that conversation with them and just say, hey, what are your boundaries? What are my boundaries? What feels good for us? What level of interaction do we want to have with each other? And just figure it out from there. And you can always revisit what those boundaries are as situations and circumstances change. So just to give an example, we did this with my friend group, and we defaulted to the least common denominator, which is the person who basically needs them or wants the most boundaries. We went to that level to make sure that everybody was feeling included, because we didn't want somebody to feel excluded from being able to socialize just because they were trying to protect themselves in a way. So we were respectful of that, and we all just hung out and didn't touch each other. So again, it wasn't the same as being able to see somebody and give them a huge hug and cuddle next to them on the couch or anything like that, but it did satisfy some of that longing and that craving for social interaction, and it was sufficient to get us to the next time and the next phase where things are starting to open up again more now. So I hope this was helpful for you guys. We're right about at the hour mark here. So yeah, again, just have conversations. Do what's most helpful for you. Have those conversations. Do what's the most helpful for you. And just remember that these are completely normal emotions to have. It's not that you're bad. It's not that anything is wrong with you. You're just a human being, and all of these emotions are there to serve you. They're there to help you grow and develop as a person. They're there for you to learn more about your own psyche and your own sacred needs, and everybody feels these feelings at a certain point. So if you need more help, or if you want more personalized insights, I'm happy to offer that to you. You can book a free complimentary consultation with me. That's on my website, and I'll include a link below in the workshop as well. So if you want to go into any more details, please let me know, and I'm happy to have that conversation. I would also love to answer any questions. You guys can comment below, any feedback, any concerns, any wins or breakthroughs or takeaways that you got from this workshop. And I'm so grateful for your time and attention today, and I hope to see you around again soon. All right, talk soon. Bye.